when one looks closely at the sketch of it, it appears to be a highly stylized animal head in profile, and one is tempted to see it as a stylized goat to match the goat skull at the bottom of the burial pit. At the bottom end of the object is a spike, perhaps for planting the object into the ground, and Hope Taylor compares this artefact to something not dissimilar at Sutton Hoo, a standard, like a military standard. So the interpretation is that this is someone who may have carried or been closely associated with a military standard, a military symbol of power and a social symbol of a particular group. So we're already starting to move here from the religious to the political. Outside the major halls where the feasting and kingliness would have occurred, with a burial that was someone closely associated with what one may assert to be part of the kingly retinue. It may have been a retainer of the king, a beloved one who was buried with the buildings in great honour. Perhaps, if I may expand from other interpretations of settlement burials, this person was buried to continue protecting the king in death as he had in life. But I am straying into speculation. But this site is filled with strange anomalies that suggest that many strange, notable, and seemingly highly worthwhile acts were occurring. The fact is, this site becomes a kingly site, but begins with religion, burial, cemeteries, worship. And remember that, it's going to become quite important. Actually, let's add to that by discussing the weirdest, most unique building at Yeavering. Building E. D2 is not the only strange building at Yeavering. There is also Building E, and this deserves the word enigmatic. Building E is unique in Britain as far as I know. It was built in Phase 2. So let me back up and explain what happened before Phase 2. In the immediate post-Roman phase, two major structures were established. The least important were some buildings called A 5 to 7. We'll come to the A series of buildings in a bit, and I will say the numbering is confusing because it relates to when the buildings were uncovered archaeologically, not when they were built chronologically. But all you need to know for now is that there was a small hall, the same size as the ones we've been talking about in the last couple of episodes, enough for a small family or two. Next to this early hall, however, was the Great Enclosure. This was a great palisaded ditch described as fort-like by Brian Hope Taylor, although he dismisses that it had a military use. Instead, he notes that, like Building D2, the Great Enclosure is devoid of any structures or notable finds. He suggests it may be in a cattle corral. Perhaps it was a market or a place to drive animals, or for people to gather in large groups at certain times of the year. There are a few buildings like this in British archaeology. Large enclosures with little in them that are hard to describe. Neolithic causewayed enclosure, Bronze and Iron Age hill forts, Iron Age banjo enclosures kind of, and all those sorts of buildings. Debates still rage as to what they are, with older archaeologists sometimes leaning towards military functions, a more modern debate shifting towards either markets or sites for mass congregations. For many reasons, and most that will come clearer later on, I think Yeavering very early on became a site of mass congregation for the Anglo-Saxons, potentially for religious reasons, and eventually, pretty certainly, a site of political control. Soon after the Great Enclosure was built, Phase 2 begins. The D series, including D2, were built, as was Building E. And this fits with the idea that Yeavering was not a settlement at first, but a place of communal gathering, perhaps for religious or social reasons, or perhaps both. And in this imagination, those early A halls may have just been places to stay or places to cook or prepare things in the rain. All that means that Yeavering has tantalising similarities to a much storied and mythologised site in Scandinavia, Uppsala. I'm going to say at the outset that drawing a connection between Yeavering and Uppsala is silly and I shouldn't be doing it. While both definitely existed, the documentary evidence from Adam of Bremen about Uppsala is incredibly problematic and beyond the scope of this episode. He talks a lot about human sacrifice, of ginormous evergreen trees, of temples bedecked in gold. Also, Uppsala is in Sweden, and the Swedes are not the people who came to Britain. There are significant cultural differences. But, and this is a big, big but, there is, I believe, what one might call meta-cultures. Groups of quite distinct cultures that nevertheless are more variations on a theme, and so they share a relation. When we talk about the modern day West, which includes countries that are definitely not in the Western Hemisphere like Australia and New Zealand, we're encapsulating several different cultures who nevertheless share a root, share many of the same beliefs, and around those beliefs many of their cultural practices vary. Italians are not American, the French, thank goodness, are not English, Germany is distinct from Denmark, which is distinct from Norway, which is distinct from Sweden, and yet, these are all Western countries. Something similar occurs in the late Iron Age of Northern Europe, the cultural complex from whence the Anglo-Saxons came. But what I imagine some of you might be saying is Uppsala. Well, if you've seen Vikings or ever watched a programme featuring the Vikings where humans are sacrificed in front of trees or in a vast hall, that's Uppsala. It was a temple, and it was destroyed in the 1080s by a Christian king. It was potentially the meeting place of the Althing of the Swedes, a great meeting of many groups, and was recognised as both an important political meeting place as well as a vital religious landscape. In the 1400s, Sweden's biggest cathedral was built over the temple site. So we have at Uppsala documentary and comparable evidence of a late Northern European Iron Age temple site that explicitly discusses the important interplay between religion and politics. So yes, Yeavering is definitely not Uppsala. They are not the same, and the comparison is a little silly. But potentially we can say they were playing a similar role, expressing or responding to a similar cultural idea. In this case then, what is Building E? Well, Building E, for want of a better word, is a theatre. We've mentioned the Althing. In later Anglo-Saxon England, an idea will develop called a moot, the root of our word meeting. It's very similar to a thing, which is what the Scandinavians came to call political meetings, and the Icelandic Althing continues to this day and is the oldest parliament in the world. Things, like moots, were presided over by a speaker, but pretty much anyone could speak at these meetings. And I think that it is likely that Building E was designed to allow for a moot to meet. Quite proud of that one. Building E is shaped like a Greek theatre, with a triangle of seats focused on a single point. The ideal design for an individual to communicate to a large number of people. The point of this triangle was not large enough to have more than one or two people on the dais or stage, and I like to imagine the speaker, or perhaps later on the king, would sit on that dais and address the important people under his control, encouraging them to speak with him, advise him, and for him to pass judgment. One can be reasonably certain that it would always have been a him. While we're a while away from medieval Christianity's systematic diminishing of women, they're far from politically liberated as far as we can tell in these communities. So the cemetery and buildings D2 and E point to a lot of highly public, visible religious activity occurring at Yeavering. So what does that tell us about Yeavering in its early stages? Clearly, this is a landscape filled with ancient meaning. Stone circles, while not uncommon in Britain, are still markers of special places, and the fact a hill fort was built after the circle before this place became popular again with the Anglo-Saxons implies that this landscape has a long, long history of religious meaning. In fact, scholars like Sarah Semple and Howard Williams would argue that this is exactly what we'd expect to see in the early Anglo-Saxon period, that there is a persistent and consistent trend towards early Anglo-Saxon communities placing important intercommunal or religious sites in landscapes already filled with ancient history. They love to connect their practices with important historic places in the landscape. The predominant feature of these recycled religious sites in the early Anglo-Saxon period was their use as cemeteries, and again, Yeavering fits the bill with multiple different burials and highly notable cemeteries, with, as I said previously, seemingly unique ordering. But I don't think people lived at Yeavering. Not for very long periods in any case. Instead, this temple site was a place for burial, for gathering, for all those small communities we discussed in the last couple of episodes to come together. It was, I believe, the focus for a nascent sense that these scattered communities were part of something larger, a wider political identity, and that Yeavering allowed for those connections to be developed, to be reinforced, and for this communal identity to be keyed into the landscape by tying this developing sense of collective into a pre-existing landscape. And I believe that the final phases reinforces this argument, as there are two more ranges of buildings for us to discuss. But we can do them together, as both the A range and the C range are both hall ranges. We've already been introduced to the A range. It's that hall from which the standard bearer burial was recovered. Let's stay with this group of halls because they come to dominate the site, running from that ginormous enclosure all the way to Building E, which, as you can't see a map of Yeavering, is quite a long way. When discussing the A range, I'm not going to tell you about every building. Instead, I'm going to focus on the more important ones, namely A2. We've obviously spoken about A4 already, that's the one with the strange burial outside, but others are all development or interconnecting buildings between A4 and A2. A4, it appears, is the oldest one of these A buildings, but A2 is exactly what you think of when you hear the terms Anglo-Saxon kingly hall. Imagine it vast, thatched with smoke curling in the eaves of this ginormous ceiling meters above you. The hall is over 80 feet, nearly 25 meters long, and it is around 40 feet, 12 meters wide. That gives it an area of 300 meters squared, a huge, huge space. Along its centre are 6 ginormous post holes and columns, and they matter because they tell us that this hall reached high, high into the sky. It was so large that it is likely that several small post holes around the edge of the building weren't simply to hold screens or for decoration, but instead acted as flying buttresses, load-bearing structures that spread the weight of a building and provided it with more stability by making it wider, while still providing the impact of being tall and narrow, like a Gothic cathedral of thatch and timber. Like many halls, it had an annex on one end, this time the eastern end, but unlike most halls, this place is filled with doors. Usually halls have a door on each of the long sides, but at building A2 there are also doors on each of the long ends, and most uncommonly of all, a door between the main hall and the annex. All of this suggests it is not a building for living in. This many doors have made it drafty and cold, and I'm pretty sure that humans have never liked sleeping with their backs to a door, which is impossible to not do in a hall designed like this. Instead, this is a place for theatre, for people appearing from unexpected directions. This is reinforced by one of the images in the report, which suggests that at the centre of this hall was a platform with a high seat. The evidence for which? Well, here is the obligatory reference to Beowulf, which is set at the same time as Yeavering was active and is seen as an artefact of cultural memory about the early origins of our Anglo-Saxon elite culture. Here is how Beowulf describes Heorot, the great hall with supposed similarities to Yeavering's A-range buildings. Heorot he named it, who wide-reaching world-sway wield 'mongst earlmen, his promise brake not, rings he lavished, treasure at the banquet, towered the hall up high and hoard-crested, huge between antlers. Heorot in Beowulf becomes a central character, the main stage upon which Beowulf's main actions occur. But it also tells us something about halls, that they had personality, that their height and decoration, horn-crested and huge between antlers, was vital to how impressive they were, and that they were at the centre of the feasting, and the most important kingly action of all in the Anglo-Saxon period, the giving of rings. This is another one of those ideas that were common across much of early medieval Northern Europe, that the sign of being a retainer was to display rings given to you by your lord, and that a good king would regularly gift generously rings to his followers. But we are starting to get ahead of ourselves. What Beowulf tells us again and again, and sentences here and whole passages there, is that at Heorot, the king presided over feast after feast after feast, and these feasts were filled with music, with stories, with boasting, and people calling each other out for being overly boastful. Promises were made, disputes settled, and glory was rewarded. It's a lot like The Lord of the Rings, and in fact, you could do a lot worse to get a sense of the glory of these vast king halls than to watch the scenes at Theoden's Hall in The Lord of the Rings, especially those after Saruman is cast from the king. The final part of this fragmentary introduction to Yeavering I've been telling is the sea-face buildings, which spread from the A range towards the Bell, along the flat whale back up to the slope, nestling themselves behind that steep, steep slope. These are a series of halls, none so large as the main A range, but what is particularly fascinating about the sea buildings is their very deliberate size and spacing and their late date. You see, the sea buildings belong to the final stages of Yeavering, when kings were well established and were toying with the idea of converting to Christianity. At this stage, when there is a conscious, centralised control, all of the buildings are built and spaced according to the Yeavering yard. This is a very particular measurement, just shy of an actual yard, which is specific to Yeavering and around which the site was constructed. All those A-range buildings, they're based on 2 squares, 40 Yeavering yards by 40 Yeavering yards. Each of the C-range buildings is 40 Yeavering yards apart and 80 Yeavering yards from the A-range. And all this I find fascinating. It shows that even in the later stage, that from the beginning until its very end stages, the site has a degree of central planning. The buildings were deliberately laid